Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is about to begin. Please make your way to the auditorium. Ladies and gentlemen, the session will begin now. Please take your seats. Welcome back to the conference. The session about reforming the international monetary system will now begin. Please welcome to the stage the chair for this session, Anoop Singh, Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Social and Economic Progress. And now, please join me in welcoming on stage the speakers for this session. Hiroshi Watanabe, President of the Institute for International Monetary Affairs. Julio Velarde, Governor of the Central Bank of Peru. Pablo Garcia Silva, Vice Governor of the Central Bank of Chile. Jean-Claude Kassi Brou, Governor of the Central Bank of Western African States. Masood Ahmed, President of the Center for Global Development. François Villeroy de Galhau, Governor of the Central Bank of France. And Michel, former Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, will be joining us online. We will close with remarks by Bernard Snoy, Chairman at Robert Triffin International Association, who will give closing remarks. Anoop Singh, the floor is yours.
All right. We have a stellar speaker and a stellar panel. So I will be very brief at the beginning before we ask Michel Camdessus to speak. Let's go back to where things started. What did Keynes say in 1930, well before the IMF was established? So Keynes wrote in 1930, the ideal arrangement would surely be to set up a supranational bank to which the central banks of the world would stand in much the same relation as their own member banks stand to them. That's what he said in 1930. As we all know, we are not there yet. Instead, the system we have has, as we know, become reliant on a dollar-based system with hope and expectations every now and then that a suitable multipolar system will develop. That has not happened. The issue is, was Keynes right? Why are we not there? what do we need to do to make it happen? And there's no one better to speak on this to begin this afternoon than Michel Camdessus, who knows more about this than anybody, and also Michel has been my boss and my leader. Michel, over to you. Okay, we can't hear you yet, so I think they're trying to work on this. There seems to be a problem with the muting of the system. Can someone help us out? Okay, so I'm afraid, Michel, we may have to come back to you because they're trying to work out what the problem is. So the problem is not only with the international financial system, it's also with the mechanics of speaking. But we will come back to you in a few minutes. So let's do this. Masood, you're here. Now, we're talking about the IMF. You have been working the last few months and many years on issues of the multilateral development banks and this World Bank report. My question is, have you got synergies with the IMF, suggestions or recommendations from your own work on this multilateral development bank that we could benefit from? Why don't you take off and tell us what have you seen as the reactions for us?
Thank you. Oh, I think Michel is back, Anoop. And if that's the case, perhaps we just ask him to come in first.
Of course. So, Michel, let's see if we can hear you. No, not yet. Not yet. Not yet, I'm afraid. So we'll come back to you.
No.
So Masood, we are back
Sorry.
with you.
So, well, let me say the following. I think you've just had a session before this on the work that was done over the last few months that N.K. Singh and Larry Summers co-chaired this effort on the future evolution of the multilateral development banks. And so I won't go into any of that. But what I will pick up is the point that you raised, Anoop, which is what did we want to say about the IMF, but didn't, because in a way that was not the focus of it. And I would just say three things that came out from that work which relate to the IMF. One, that it was very clear that it's going to be a world going forward in which many countries are going to be subjected to exogenous shocks more often and of deeper shocks. And at the moment, the global safety net for many countries is very limited. And it's fine for the countries that can self-insure, but for the ones that it doesn't make sense to self-insure, they turn to the IMF, but the IMF's current set of facilities is not really geared to respond to them. And the reason we got into this issue from the MDB work is because as a result, the MDBs are often called to fill the gap when there is an external shock. And they've always grumbled about that as not being their role. But now, if you particularly want them to focus on helping countries to develop long-term plans for transforming their economies and to focus on climate, then throwing in the middle of that a need to pull money out of what they were planning to do and respond to quick balance of payments assistance is something that's a bit disruptive and best left to the IMF. So we felt the IMF needs to become much more effective as part of a global safety net. That's number one. Number two, it was also very clear that the work that's being done on dealing with debt levels that are unsustainable and are posing difficulties in terms of fiscal space for expenditures in low-income countries particularly, but increasingly in a number of middle-income countries, requires a different approach. And I think many people have many ideas on what this approach should be, but there isn't yet a cohesive alternative to working within a frame that everybody starts by saying, well, this is not working well, but then we don't know where to go next. And I think the MDBs cannot do this by themselves. It's really the IMF has to probably take a more central role in helping to solve the debt issue going forward. And then I think the last thing that we felt, something the IMF should do, if you look at the next 15 years, there's going to be quite important changes in the pattern of national financial flows within countries, fiscal flows, investment flows, but also international flows. Whether there is climate change with an adequate response or whether there is climate change without an adequate response, it has huge consequences for the way in which finance will flow. And we felt that the IMF's surveillance work, which currently is still quite short-term focused, needs to be supplemented with looking at longer-term perspectives for what's going to happen to financial markets and financial flows. And this is not dependent on what is the policy response, but it's a function that there are multiple scenarios of how these flows will pan out, depending on the nature and effectiveness of the policy response to it. But it's some work that at the moment the IMF doesn't really do, and also the MDBs are not really equipped to do. So those were three practical areas of spillovers that came over from the work that was being done in the MDBs in relation to what could apply to the IMF. Let me stop with that.
Thank you. The surveillance side is very important, and if I have time, I'll come back to it. But can we see if Michel can start talking to us? So let's try, Michel. Maybe you can try to speak to us. No, I think not yet. Not yet. I think we have to wait. We have to wait. All right. Let's come back to our panel. Maybe I'm going to turn to Pablo Garcia Silva. Can I speak? You have also led the Irving Fisher Committee at the BIS. Let me ask you, if Keynes's supranational IMF had developed, the sense is that global liquidity should have become a public good. Now, how do you see this issue from the BIS also? And what does the IMF have to do to better manage global liquidity trends? So, over to you.
Thank you, Anoop. I want to take a point of view that maybe has the starting point of the glass half full rather than the glass half empty. Some of the shocks that affect the global economy surely have to do with US monetary policy. Surely the mandate of the Fed to deal with their internal imbalances then can spill out to the world. But it's also the case that the US is the safe asset. US treasuries are the safe assets. And uncertainty shocks, not linked to US monetary policy, tend to create these cycles, these financial cycles, and those would happen probably independent of how the global monetary policy is managed. Why did I say that I think that the glass is somewhat half full? Because I think there have been three major developments over the past 20 years in the evolution of the international monetary system that have worked to improve it, to make it more resilient, to make it more resistant to crisis, and to make the effects on each of our economies less critical. One is the fact that China has delinked from its peg to the US dollar. The link of the Chinese economy and monetary policy to the US was unsustainable if China became so large and therefore became in some way an amplifier of US monetary policy shocks. It is very welcome that more flexibility on the renminbi is in place, that more monetary policy autonomy and currency flexibility is there so as to avoid that amplifying mechanism, and I think that has played a very significant role now compared to the early 2000s. The second factor that has been evolving over time is the increased popularity and effectiveness of inflation targeting and flexible exchange rate regimes. In many emerging countries, this has become the preferred way of dealing with monetary policy. And if you look at the spectrum of the world in the past 20 years, increasingly it is the case that emerging markets are not the fulcrum or the focus of attention because there is a crisis, systemic crisis somewhere that is dealing or creating a lot of attention, except in a few exceptions that we can discuss. In Latin America, in Asia, in emerging Europe, we can see systems of monetary policy that have become way more resilient to these fluctuations in the global financial cycle that happens either because of this demand for safety or because of the United States monetary policy. The third one is obviously the creation of the euro. The euro has been a monumental achievement. I think sometimes one forgets about the magnitude of the implication of the creation of the euro. And that shows that for the purpose of providing safe assets, the safety is not on the side of the supplier, but rather on the side of the confidence that markets and the public puts into that. There is a fourth development that is more limited, because all these things that I've mentioned have happened at the national level. On the multilateral level, there have been a few more modest advances. The safety net of the IMF indeed can be improved, but I think they have done a significant amount of change compared to what we had in the 90s. They recently announced this review of their liquidity facilities for distinct from the SBA, for the FCL and others, and I think it is a fundamental change towards a safety net that has the idea of providing common insurance and avoiding self-insurance, having facilities that depend on the structure and the institutions of the countries, and they are not state-dependent, they are not time-dependent, but rather they are more permanent, conditional on strong frameworks. I think that is a very important future. And there's been some changes in the governance of the IMF. Going forward, clearly those need to be deepened. There's still quite a way to go to make the international financial institutions more representative of the world we live today, and also to increase the firepower and the ability of these institutions to deploy liquidity in times of crisis. There is a discussion about the size of the fund that is ongoing. It's very political, but I believe clearly the world should go forward to that. Fragmentation is a risk. I think fragmentation might be maybe a little bit attractive or seen as a shortcut, but clearly it's not the case. We need to continue to have an integrated world and to build upon each of our own experience to make it more.
All right, thank you very much. You rightly point out the IMF has taken reforms in recent weeks, so some steps are being taken. Now, by the way, Michel, I've been told that we will ask you to speak a little bit later on. For some reason, we need a bit more time to get the technicalities to work out. So while we wait for you, maybe I'll turn to Governor François Villeroy. And let me make just one point. Michel and I have spoken and written about the need for sequenced steps to a multinational. financial system, you have spoken about building a creative frontier. So can you tell us what you have in mind? What are the reforms needed in your mind for such a creative frontier of an international financial system? Thank you.
No, thank you for putting the question. And thank you for inviting me. May I first apologize for being a man. I'm not the only one. I am not the only one on stage, but I pay tribute to the Nobel Prize Committee, who gave his award this week to Claudia Goldin about her works on women on the labor market and in economics. So we are probably the last fully male panel worldwide. This would be a first step in the sequence agenda to a better material. That said, you were kind enough to invite me to give a full speech after this panel, so I will not tell everything. But I agree on the idea on sequencing, and I would like to stress the idea of focusing. I was invited last year, it was a great honor, to give the so-called Kansu lecture in Washington by Kristalina Georgieva. And I insisted on the need of what I call a pragmatic or focused multilateralism. Sometimes we are too ambitious, especially in the difficult world we live in. And if I had to propose, at least for our financial meetings, some focus, I would insist on A, climate, B, cryptos and cross-currency payments. It can look technical, boring. It's extremely important to avoid fragmentation. And perhaps the third C would be cybersecurity, but this is a common challenge. I am aware it's much more difficult to deal with in the IMF meetings or in the G20. I completely agree with what you said about the fact that the IMF is probably, in the present landscape, the institution. I am less familiar with MDBs, but it's the institution which resists best. It's a relative appreciation because there are also difficult challenges for the IMF, and so there is a tendency to use the IMF for broader and broader purposes. I think the IMF is legitimate with the World Bank to incorporate climate goals in its mission because climate change has more and more economic consequences. And if I take the example of central banks, you are all aware of this debate about the mandate of central banks. If we incorporate climate change, is it mission creep, is it politicization? In our case, in the ECB, we have a primary mandate of price stability. For me, it's enough. Climate change already affects price stability, including in the short term. It also affects the level of activity and public finance. See Argentina, see Pakistan, or see in my home continent, Greece, 1 month ago. So I think it's not mission creep, including for the IMF. About the sequencing, I could only repeat what Pablo said. There has been significant first steps, but I would insist perhaps slightly more on the half empty glass. It cannot be enough, but I will say more. I will say more a bit later. So full agreement about sequencing, but I would add the question of the scope with this idea of pragmatism, of focusing on some common goals, and there are significant ones. We could do perhaps a bit less, but deliver and deliver better.
Thank you very much. Let's turn to Julio Velarde, who is an old friend of mine. Am I right that you are the longest serving governor in Latin America?
No, Dominican Republic is.
Oh, all right. Then you at least the second longest, maybe across the world.
No, Morocco is here.
I see, okay, the third. You have seen the IMF in Latin America over the years.
Sure.
We want to hear from you how to take these steps. But my question is, as part of the IMF's role is to become a lender of last resort, how do you manage that with dealing with the debt crises that countries face, who also need a lender of last resort? This comes back to issues we discussed earlier this afternoon too. But over to you, please.
I would say part of you were discussing at the start was a little bit different. It was lender of last resort, but not for countries in crisis. Right. It was for the system in general. And I believe, I don't know if proper liquidity maybe can help on that, but a scheme like the Banco with fixed exchange rate between countries probably is very hard now to implement it. Of course, probably volatility is too high. Probably the bets on the way the currency is going are too high. When I have seen the numbers of the biggest portfolio administrators, for example, the 500 biggest portfolio administrators manage more money than the GDP. What we have seen since 2000 particularly is the financial wealth has increased more than GDP. We have the gross inflows or outflows to emerging markets, to all emerging markets, have never been even 1% of those money that is managed by these portfolio managers. So some need will be to try to accommodate not so much volatility. It's not so easy. And some of the proposals that are being pushed by the IMF, I believe are in the right direction. For example, swap agreements, but they are too small. Twice the quota is almost insignificant. If you want to have an intervention, potential intervention, you cannot commit so few resources that almost it will not be seen as a signal. In our case, twice the quota will be what we sometimes have intervened in 1 hour, ridiculous, completely, no? And probably part of it has not to be based on quotas. Of course, there has been some criteria to when to help, when to trigger the help, and of course the country has to have good fundamentals. In our case, we are one of the few countries that have ever used the flexible credit line. The flexible credit line was created in March 2009. If they have offered us that line in 2008, or let's say November 2008, we would have taken it. When it appeared, when they created it, we were already so full of money entering the country that it was almost unneeded. And we took the flexible line with COVID. We didn't use it, we have reduced it to half. In COVID, you didn't know if the lockdowns were going to last 4 weeks or 4 months. So in that case, you prefer to have more ammunition so as to face the crisis. But we have never used it. And I believe for many emerging market countries that have access to financial markets, that have good fundamentals, what we want is a lender of last resort in crisis. The problem is that the amounts are too little. That was even in spite of an increase of 1/3 of quotas that is being proposed now. Probably the amounts, if you follow quotas, are too little for emerging markets more integrated in a world where financial wealth has increased a lot. No? And I would say that those are the main points. Of course, in the case of debt, the pressure of the IMF to other creditors to take part in the agreement is important. And some countries also that are more resistant to have any kind of haircut. No? Thank you.
Thank you. You've spoken importantly about the governance structure in many ways. And just for 1 second, if I might make a point, the first point in the summary of the paper by Michel, Bernard Snoy, and myself is the importance for the IMF to give equal surveillance of systemic countries and countries that have reserve surpluses. And we have not been there yet. And just very briefly, why do I say that? So many of you may not know, and I might just inject this point, that before the global financial crisis, and I say this with full credibility, like in 2006, 2007, the IMF did ask the United States to do a financial sector assessment program in order to see if the pressure that we're building up were going to lead to a systemic crisis. The IMF had established a financial sector assessment program system after the Asian crisis. And the thought was, if things are going so bad as they are, the IMF should do such an assessment of the United States. At that time, this plan, this assessment program, was not a mandatory instrument. The US refused. Let me stop at that point. Let me turn to Governor Brou. You represent many West African states. How do you see the need for a supranational bank like Keynes spoke about? Do you feel it's important to build up the steps to go towards this creative frontier that Governor François Villeroy spoke about?
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting us. The BCRO, the Central Bank of a 8-member country monetary union. I think maybe to put your question in the context of developing countries, African developing countries, we need to go back to the situation. In the last 2-3 years, we've seen many shocks, important shocks. We had the COVID shocks, we had the price of petroleum, energy shocks, food price shocks, and all those development created very, very strong fiscal imbalances, balance of payment imbalances, of course, high inflation, and in a context where starting in 2022, with the monetary policy of developed countries, it was very difficult for member countries to mobilize resources on international market. Of course, you create very, very, very strong balance of payment pressure and strong pressure on reserve. And we saw the IMF intervene with his instrument, his different facility, in fact, really providing resources to support balance of payment of member countries. So I think the IMF did good job in this situation, and those macroeconomic tensions are still going on. And the IMF is present still. We have 6 out of the 8 member countries with program using resources from the various IMF facilities. But the situation is getting, of course, more and more complicated because, and that's the second point I would like to make, we're having pressure, issues with energy transition, food security, pressure with impact of climate change, pandemic, fragilities, and in our area, security issues. And all those issues feed and are feeding in the macro imbalances on fiscal and balance of payment. So in this situation, we need a very strong IMF. We need an IMF that has substantial and adequate resources to support those countries, our countries, during this difficult time. And not only with, of course, adequate resources, but of course, the subsidized part of the facility to really ensure concessional financing. Because what we have seen also developing in the last few years is the debt sustainability being under pressure. So it's important that we continue in this direction. Of course, we have there are discussion currently in the IMF on the 16 quota review, and we hope that that will allow the IMF to have adequate resources, stable resources, resources from the quota, because also it's important that we don't forget all those key issues that are going, that are being discussed, like the formula reviews, the redirection of the quota distribution to allow really more resources to flow to countries where there are needs. And that brings me to your question. Yes, of course, looking back at this sentence by John Maynard Keynes in the 30s, yes, a supranational bank lender of last resort will have done the job. But not having that, at least we need to have a very strong IMF with adequate resources to really play this role. Thank you. I'll stop that.
Thank you very much. So Hiroshi-san, the floor is yours before we go back to Michel. Just one point from me. You are the only person here, I think, from the Indo-Pacific region. If these sequence steps or reforms are going to take effect, they will need agreement across the shareholders. We need Japan's support, that of the Indo-Pacific region. How do you see that framework for getting agreement on these reforms across the shareholders?
Yeah, anyway, we need some of the support and also the agreement on the issues to that. But I have a little bit of the suspicion on the supranational bank to that. The reason is still some big number of the countries, central bank cannot have the independence. In the old days, such countries' share is very much limited in the size of the GDP, but now it's growing to that. So if you're going to have some supranational or super central bank, in that case, you have to think about how the mixture of the business of the Ministry of Finance and also the central bank do that. So that's to be sorted out to do that. And in that sense, I think we are going to have the more good discussion on issues. The first one, the IMF has more good emphasis on the monitoring of the size of the total debt of each country to that. Or, of course, controlling is not so easy to that, but still they have to make good monitoring how much they borrow, and then also how to limit the expansion, or easy expansion of such kind of debt. That is the first step the IMF should go on to that. In that case, the IMF should have some good watching of each country's operation, and the IMF is ready to cope with such kind of the crisis of some country to that. The surveillance is very good, but also it would be supported by some good information over each country to that. And along with this, I'd like to discuss issues. I'm from Asia, or maybe I'm coming from the ASEAN Plus 3 to that. So you remember the ASEAN Plus 3 has made arrangement of the Chiang Mai initiative to use their reserve to have the other countries' crisis to that. And at the time, the first stage, I think IMF is not so welcoming. Even the United States is not welcoming, but we have done it. But since then, Europe has a similar system to that. So I think that the cooperation of the regional arrangement of the IMF is quite important to that. So how to keep such kind of the relation is another important issue. So in that sense, I think other region which is not covered by such kind of the regional arrangement, we would be ready to discuss on the issues to that. The other part of the Asia and the Eurasia, and also Latin America, and also the Africa. All days, this area is very much dependent on the ODA. They have little access to the private money to that. But now they graduate such kind of the ODA dependent country to that. Now they are going to have big access to the private money to that. And also, unfortunately, some country offers quasi-concessional conditional loan to that. It is really expanding the debt to that. So how to stop such kind of operation, that is quite important. In that sense, I think that each region has some kind of good arrangement, and they have the good coordination with the IMF. It would help the more good the operation of the IMF in the future to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's hope we can go back to Michel Camdessus now. And not yet, I'm being told. Okay, apparently not yet. So we have to come back to Michel, hopefully in a few more minutes. Shall we open up maybe for questions before we hear Michel and before we hear Bernard, who knows more about these issues than anyone I know of, to give us his sense of where we are in this. So let's have some questions. Let me ask the first one. Let me ask Governor Brou a question. So now that the IMF has made it, I believe, easier for countries with excess reserves to transfer SDRs to other countries, why is that not happening more of? And why are your banks not taking up on that? If I may ask you that one question. Yes, so why do you think other central banks are not taking up this somewhat flexible system whereby SDRs can be transferred from those who don't need them to those who may want them? Maybe, Julio, you could make some commentary on that too.
Yes, of course, those developments are in the, of course, in the right direction, because it should really improve the discrepancy we see between the needs and the mobilization. If you take, for example, the last allocation of SDR that took place 2 years ago, the whole continent, African continent, got 5% of it. We in WAMU got less than 0.5%. So there are needs, but the system is such that the mobilization of those resources are not in line with that. And as you know, when you mobilize resources on the IMF fund program, it's based on the quota system. So of course, it limits. Now, the fact that reserve can be transferred from excess reserve country to other can help and in improving the situation, although I think it needs to be more, process needs to be more streamlined so that we central banker can really see how we can really improve this situation. Because again, the reality is that under stress as we are facing today, access to reserve is still not something that is very, very easy. As access to SDR, to reserve, is not something which is that easy. And having a peg, we have an exchange rate pegged to the euro. Of course, this has brought us tremendous advantage, very low inflation. We are practically lowest inflation on the continent. Inflation running today at 4%. So we've really, it has helped us stabilize in terms of the inflationary pressure. But this, of course, put additional pressure on having enough reserve to support the development financing of the economy.
All right. Julio, maybe you can give us some thoughts.
Actually, we have quite, we're with Thailand, excluding the oil exporting country of Saudi Arabia, where the countries with more reserves compared to GDP. So actually, it's very hard for us to ask for more money in our case, and we don't have so many SDRs ourselves, so as to give to others. So it's not so important. Regional agreements are increasing, like in Asia, where it's more important. In Latin America, unfortunately, we have a regional agreement where there is no rich country. We are part of the Latin American Reserve Fund, where Chile is also part, but there is no Germany or no Japan and China so as to provide enough liquidity. Yeah, but let's finish a little point. What is important is this managed liquidity, but it has to be developed idea. It's not so easy. But we have big problems of inflows, enormous inflows. So you have the capacity not only of lending, but absorbing also.
Yes,
it's swaps that can be going both ways if you want. But it's pretty difficult. But you need to do something because the magnitude of the flows probably are going to get bigger compared to the size of the economies, and they can be pretty stabilizing. I don't see much merit in countries that have strong fundamentals for the currencies to go up 40% 1 year, up, and then the next year 40% down.
All right. Let's move to some questions from the audience. What I've been just told is that we may not be able to get the mechanics to work to hear Michel. So it is possible that he may not be able to speak to us. It is a shame. So Bernard, you will have to, in your own remarks.
Yes. Very good. It seems that there is everywhere some feeling that there is a need. Oh, okay.
No. So what I was saying is, let's get some questions first.
I could summarize what
Yes, and then when we come to you, you can summarize what Michel was going to say and give your own thoughts.
Okay.
But before that, let's get some questions from the audience. I have a number of questions I could ask, but I've already asked too many. So who wants to ask us, the panel, some questions? Yes, please. Yes, so you go first.
Should I go?
No, me?
All right, he has.
Yes, a question actually to Mr. Watanabe-san. You talked about the ASEAN +3, the extension, internationalization of the Chiang Mai Agreement. Now, it has never been put into action, but it's been there. Would you recommend this type of arrangements indeed for other regions? And what would be the minimum necessary conditions for it to work?
Yeah, thank you. As the governor said, in the case of ASEAN +3, we have the reserve sufficient countries like China and Japan to that, so it works to that. But already we discussed the issue of how to transfer the SDR to the other country. It's not the faraway country, just a neighbor country. Such kind of arrangement is still working. I think that could be the cases to that. So anyway, the step by step is very much important. As the Ngozi said, the talking is very cheap, but the real action makes history. So in that sense, I think the detailed stepping is going to be important in the coming days. In that sense, I think that as far as we have some tools of the SDR that can be shared or that can be used in the region, that is one of the important issues to that. And you mentioned about the Chiang Mai initiative has been never carried out because we put the name crisis arrangement. So no one country wants to have, we are in the crisis. So now we have to change the name for the enhanced arrangement. That could be very much important to that. But so far, the Asian countries are rather lucky. Just only one country, Korea, has some difficulty. At the time, Korea asked the FRB in New York to make the money to that. But the other country didn't have any such kind of difficulty. But from now on, I think the big money came into Asia. That is, in the future, would be the seed of the cause of such kind of difficult situations. So now we are really ready to that kind of operation to that. Thank you.
All right, there was a question over there. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Well, I'm getting older, and I will explain why. When I was in the 70s at the university, I was already instructed debt is an issue, in the developing world in particular. Then I came to the World Bank as an executive director in the 90s. Again, debt is an issue. Now I'm here. Yesterday, and in each panel today, we have heard about debt. And we are, again, in the same kind of situation. I'm not speaking about domestic debt, I'm speaking about international debt. Of course, it's the responsibility of the developed countries, but also the developing countries, but it's also the responsibility of the MDAs. Why have we not taken the lesson from the past? And why are we rediscussing the debt issue, knowing what the solution will be? There will be debt cancellation, rescheduling. So the same kind of problems as we had in the past. So my question to anybody in the panel, how was it possible that for the third time in the 30 years, we're facing the same kind of problems? I'm speaking about international debt again.
So please, you go first.
That's I think, an excellent point. But I would argue that we see some advances. We see some economies where international debt is not anymore a problem, whereas it was a problem in the 70s and it was a problem in the 80s. In Latin America, for instance, except a few exceptions, the development of domestic capital markets has advanced far enough that external debt is not an issue. The funding needs of the government, the funding needs of corporates are satisfied through deep and liquid domestic capital markets, where even investors from abroad get exposure in domestic currency. This also is the case elsewhere. So it's true that debt continues to be an issue, but I think there is a number of examples where it has started to be less so of an issue. And maybe the reason is that one dimension that we need to think about is not only how to get external liquidity to deal with the global financial cycle, but also how to reduce our own sensitivity to those cycles by bolstering the credibility of our own currency and domestic bond markets. That has been, I think, a significant advance in a number of economies. And so maybe not all is so, maybe I have the problem of the glass half full, right? But indeed, there remains an issue elsewhere. But in some other places, like in Latin America, it is much less so than 30 or 40 years ago.
No, important question. And Pablo is right, there has been progress in some continents. But for the general trend, I can only agree with you, it's a recurrent disease. It comes back each 10th or each 20th year. Can I perhaps insist on another dimension of the debt crisis, which is not about figures, but which is about its composition and how we are able to deal with it? You mentioned restructuration. After the crisis of the 70s and partly of the 80s, we were smart enough collectively to invent two clubs, the Paris Club for public creditors and the London Club for private creditors, at that time banks. I don't say it was perfect, but it worked. And it helped Pablo and Julio under your control also for Latin America. And not only for Latin America. The new problem we have now is that the composition of debt changed significantly. If I look at public creditors, we know the most important creditor is not member of the Paris Club, that is China. And there are tremendous efforts to involve China as a creditor on a pari passu basis with other public creditors. We have limited cases of success, but really limited in Africa. I think this is a key challenge. To have something like a new Paris Club, a broadened public club, where we have all public creditors with equal rights and duties. And if I look at the private creditors, there has always also been a change. It's probably not mainly banks, or not only banks, it's financial markets, bonds. And we know how difficult it is to restructure bonds. Look at the Greek crisis, how difficult it was. And here also we have to find mechanism to ensure the equality of treatment and a comprehensive approach of all creditors. This is what the IIF is about, but we are not yet far enough. So I insist also on this dimension. There is a question of figure, and this was your message, but it's also a question of structure, and we need new mechanisms to deal with this new structure.
Right, thank you. Now, before we go on to other questions, the latest development is this. Michel has important messages for us, and as you know, we can't connect. So Harinder is kindly going to read out to us what Michel was going to tell us. And then, if there's time, we'll go back to questions before we turn on to Bernard Snoy.
Thank you very much. I think that there is two essential messages.
No, So the latest is Harinda is going to read out. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you, Anoop. So Michel Camdessus just called me on the phone. First, he's very sorry that technology failed. Just before we started the session, we had tested the system, and he is actually at Banque de France, which is right next to his office and his apartment in Paris. And the system was working perfectly. We tested twice, and the video was working. But then, as we went live, it suddenly failed, and we've tried for 45 minutes, again and again, and somehow it doesn't work. So he just called me and requested me that I read the text of his message to you personally on his behalf. So if you'll please pardon my accent. There's no way I can match the power of his words, but bear with me. This is what he was going to say. But I'm knowing him, and the governor knows him so much better. He always...
If you allow me, I must confess, technically, I must confess it's a Banque de France system in Paris. But it worked, and for sure it works. So we don't have fully the explanation, but please go on with the message.
So, the formal text that he was going to read, but I'm sure he was going to put a different flavor as he was going to read. Dear friends, it is a great honor and privilege for me to be invited. I should possibly say to be urges me, by the Emerging Markets Forum and the Policy Center for the New South to address you for a few minutes. It was going to be exactly 9 minutes. As a matter of fact, I see myself as a passenger clandestine, a stowaway, who would have been invited to open the gala ceremony in the magnificent ballroom of the Titanic. A stowaway extremely concerned indeed by the present navigation conditions. I will limit myself to make 3 points. I bring intensely in my heart and mind in this very moment. By the way, he and I debated whether he should use the Titanic as an illustration, and we agreed it was the right illustration at this moment related to the global monetary system. First point, my friends, allow me to tell all of my compassion for the victims of the earthquake and all my admiration to them and to the people of Morocco for their courage and reliance in facing the tragedy and the labor of reconstruction. May the appropriate and generous support of the international community be promptly put in place. Second point, I do not want to miss this occasion to congratulate my friends and the founding fathers of the Centennial and the Emerging Markets Forum for their extraordinary achievements over the last 18 years. Their purposes were to offer their support to emerging countries in what we saw at that time as a long, difficult, but immensely promising step towards full-fledged development. This has been done successfully by many of them, even if they had to face enormous obstacles and worldwide crises. The EMF can be proud to see them having achieved their goals and to be in a position now to share an equal footing with the leaders of yesterday, the common responsibility of bringing the world to a better future. As it will represent better the entire membership, such new governance could be expected to serve better the universal common good. And now, as I come to my third point, back to the ballroom of the Titanic, back to our deep concerns of today, the organization team has circulated a very straightforward document summarizing the critical issues requiring our deep and urgent attention and commitment. Suffice to mention the financial impasse of the global economy, a process of defragmentation of the system accelerating, a multilateral system questioned, if not already ignored, growing poverty and wars taking away millions of lives, wars after Ukraine, Karabakh, and Israel, who will be next, and major crises now possibly any time. My dear friends, all along these almost 20 years here in the forum, we have been suggesting time and again the changes which could allow the world economy to face the challenging of this new century, so promising at the beginning, so terrifying today. We have been listened to with interest and sympathy, but very poor corrective actions have been taken. But today, on October 21, 2023, it is now 5 to midnight at the clock of the Titanic. Time indeed to send to the leaders of the world the urgent message our common long experience suggests. A major initiative must be taken. All leaders of the world must join forces to restore prospects for peace, stability, and equitable development, opposing to the present process of fragmentation of the global system, decisive progress towards a renovated multilateralism. A key element of this package, together with similar measures in the field of long-term development and initiatives to restore a climate of dialogue among actors, must be a deep reform of International Monetary Fund. It should rest on 3 pillars: an unquestionable fairness, a mandate effectively adapted to the problems of today and of the foreseeable future. And third, a strengthened monetary governance to give to the youth of today and to the next generation the assurance that we are doing everything we can, joining universally our forces to recreate prospects for a promising future. Mr. Chairman, the paper I referred to, we have prepared together with Bernard Snoy, summarizing the steps to be taken under these last 3 pillars for the radical renovation of the fund. It will certainly be reinforced by contribution of your exceptional panel of speakers to suggest to our leaders no more the wording of well-intentioned communique, but steps for the immediate and decisive actions to be taken. We know well how hard it will be, the task of our leaders. We urge them to succeed where the predecessors failed or preferred to postpone decisions or just ignore the issues. We call each of them now some sacrifices. Of course, I hear your question. Why should those who currently control the system yield part of their long-held power and privileges even to help make governance of the International Monetary Fund more legitimate, credible, and robust from now on? Is that not too much to ask? I do not think so. It is now 5 to midnight. Action is required right away because it is on this legitimacy, on this credibility, on this strength of the new fund that lie our chances to create the prospects of a better future for our children and grandchildren. And I will add, even if it is unusual to refer to these fundamental realities, that it is legitimate to believe that faced with the immenseness of disaster, men, and even rich men, are capable of transcending their own interests to preserve the common good and to improve the life of their fellow human beings, and so obeying the sole duty mentioned in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All human beings endowed with reason and conscience should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. My friends, God bless you. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you. Now, time is a factor for us as well, and I realize there are some questions which have not yet been posed. But can I now turn to Bernard Snoy to give us his summary and concluding remarks? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You have heard basically a fundamental message from Michel Camdessus. It is the sense of urgency of the reform, not only of the IMF, but of the international monetary system. And he listed 3 important areas. Let me just focus on those which I think are the most important. In the chapter, Unquestionable Fairness, of course, the first issue are the quotas. There is a need to empower. There is a need to give more voice to the Global South. We know very well how contentious, how difficult this issue can be. It has also to be combined, perhaps, with a reduction of the veto power of the largest shareholder by bringing down, and this was a consensus when Michel Camdessus chaired the Palais Royal initiative. Even Paul Volcker agreed that this would be a necessity to go lower than the current majority of 85 for important decisions, to bring it down perhaps to 75 or 70. We have heard that we could perhaps link that to other issues, such as China's agreement to play the game when it comes to debt rescheduling by, in a way, merging the Paris Club, perhaps, and their own system to alleviate their claims. Fairness also in the allocation or in the use of SDRs and their allocation when new allocation would be decided in the future. There is already some progress in asking industrialized countries to transfer their unused SDR to some of the trust funds created by the IMF, but perhaps in the future we could decide that 20% of new allocation would be dedicated to the lowest income countries. And then there is also the questions of fairness in surveillance. We all know that surveillance applies essentially to the countries that have to come to the IMF for assistance. But in fact, surveillance would be perhaps much more needed for countries of systemic importance and countries that are running for a long period of time big surpluses. And we know Keynes' view that sometimes surpluses are as bad for global macroeconomic development than excessive deficits. In the chapter on adjusting the mandate of the IMF to the world of the 21st century, the first item is surveillance of capital flows. And those of you coming from emerging countries know how much capital flows can be destabilizing and can reflect also the changes in the monetary policy of the dominant country. We need also a cooperative management of world liquidities. We in the Robert Triffin International Association, we wrote a report on managing global liquidity as a global public good. This is a team that Michel Camdessus thinks also extremely important. And of course, it is linked also to the issue of the use in the future of the SDRs as a way for the IMF to provide additional liquidity in periods of shortages and withdraw them in periods of surabundance. But of course, this would require the possibility to have a market in SDR assets. Also, we know that the US is in a way overextended in its debt. Even there was a downgrading recently of the US debt, and we would need alternatives to safe assets only in the US Treasury bonds. Of course, it's very good if the euro area can provide such safe assets, but in the long term, we have to think about ways to develop a market for SDR-denominated assets. And last but not least, of course, there is the question of the status of the IMF as lender of last resort. We know that currently the firepower of the IMF is insufficient and relatively small compared to bilateral swap arrangements or even to regional safety nets. We would need, first of all, to have a more explicit recognition in the Articles of Agreement on the IMF on its role of lender of last resort, and of course in its role in debt rescheduling, and that should come with a significant increase in the resources of the IMF. Last but not least, of course, is the strengthening of global governance. We have seen the increase in the role of the G20. This is surely something extremely good, but at the same time, the democratic accountability of the IMF is based on the 23 seats. And here you have two issues, that there is no correspondence between the G20 and the 23 seats, and we would probably need in the G20 a system comparable to the system that we have in the IMF with constituencies, with perhaps a rotating role for the members, so that we would have a universal representation. But then also Michel Camdessus comes with a specific proposal, which is to give more power to the International Monetary and Financial Committee, where you have, in principle, elected members, ministers of finance, and also, it's very important, governors of central bank. And he proposes that the executive board, which is composed, let's say, by technocrats, I mean, very excellent technicians, but which have a lesser democratic accountability, would prepare the agenda and the decisions. I think that in this way, what Michel Camdessus, together with Anoop and myself, propose is bold, but at the same time, relatively pragmatic. Of course, the current circumstances of polarization make it difficult to have the negotiation now, but let's say we always need at least a blueprint, and if possible, a sequenced agenda for when circumstances would be better. And last but not least, I think that this topic of the reform of the international monetary system is intimately related to all the other topics considered by Emerging Markets Forum as of overarching importance. If we had more time, we could detail the links between reform of the international monetary system and climate change, a link with the way international financial markets operate. We still are in danger of new major crises, as Robert Triffin had recognized. This is also intimately linked, of course, to the future of the global multilateral system. And perhaps, as we will hear tomorrow, this is linked also to the issue of inequality. But I think that's enough for my own presentation, and I'm open to other questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'm not sure we have much more time, so let me just make one point to all of you and to Harinder. I can see on many of your faces your reactions and questions that you have not asked us yet. I think this issue obviously needs much more discussion. We need to come back to this in some way. There are many aspects of what a global central bank could do. And we have just touched on some of those aspects. So let's hope we have a discussion to build a political awareness of the need for the world to move this way. And thank you, everyone on the panel, and thank you all.
The session on reforming the international monetary system has ended. François Villeroy de Galhau, please remain on stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We will now move to a keynote address on the future of multilateralism. Oui, c'est un keynote speech. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for the keynote speech.
Yeah.
He's our vice chairman.
And now, please join me in welcoming on stage the moderator for this keynote, Harinder Kohli, Founding Director and Chief Executive at the Emerging Markets Forum. Harinder Kohli, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Gentlemen, can we kindly sit down? So we'll start now the final working session of the day before we break for dinner. And I will use two words which are commonly used, but I really mean them. It's my real pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Governor Villeroy. If I may dare to say, a friend. He's been very kind to host our forum twice now in Banque de France, including last year. He's a very gracious and generous host, very kind. He took not only a formal interest in hosting our forum last year, but very deep interest as to what were the topics we were going to discuss, how we were going to discuss, who were going to be the people on the key panels. Very probing questions, which I must say, very impressed by how much interest he was showing. Thank you, Governor. And then, of course, he hosted us a dinner in the famous Golden Gallery, which only the governor of Banque de France can open. And it's a stunning gallery. And he gave us, if I may say so, Governor, share a secret, he gave us a very amusing history of why the gallery was built and by whom. And it's not very often that you hear the governor of Banque de France crack some jokes, because he is known as a very top intellect in France and serious. So it was a pleasure. So now we're waiting for him to invite us back to France. Governor, it's an honor, and this is going to be a highlight of our entire forum. He's very kind to, he's kindly agreed to discuss a topic which is truly of deep interest to the entire world and certainly emerging markets. The issue of the future of multilateralism, a topic we've been talking about for almost every year for the last 8-9 forums. But it's becoming more and more important with every passing year. Why? And, you know, last year you might remember Sir Suma had written even a paper on the subject. Why is very simple. We each given year, going year, the issues which matter the most to emerging markets are more and more globally interconnected. And yet, most multilateral institutions which are central to addressing these global issues are becoming less and less fit in addressing these global issues. And most people feel in emerging markets, or emerging market economies, that the multilateral system is not as relevant as it was 30, 40 years ago in addressing their needs. So here is the governor of Banque de France going to give his views on future of the multilateralism. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you, dear Olinda and dear friends. Thank you for inviting me to give this keynote speech. Thank you for reminding us of very good memories we share. Last year in Paris, the Galerie Dorée, and many of you were there, Michel Cansu's birthday. It was the 89th birthday. We celebrated the 90th birthday some months ago, by the way. Unfortunately, the subject of my speech today is less rejoicing. And you mentioned it, we are collectively witnessing a growing crisis of multilateralism, which can lead to an increasingly fragmented world. So tonight I would like to share with you a few personal and free views. I don't pretend these are French official views, on three hard facts, three needs in response, and one hope about the future of multilateralism. 3 + 1 equals 7. I wouldn't pretend to compare with the great T.E. Lawrence and his 7 pillars of wisdom, but let us try to plant some seeds of wisdom in this troubled world. And as I am aware, I am the last obstacle between you and dinner, I will try to be not too long and to be strong enough. So let me start with the 3 hard facts. A, the disease of nationalism is on the rise and is often coupled with populism, power politics, and protectionism. Its most extreme expression obviously lies in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It has also spread to other countries in the world, and notably underpinned the rise of China. But let us acknowledge, we are all contaminated to various degrees with the affirmation of India, or with the America First policy in the US fueling a trade war. And even in Europe, it acted as a driving force for Brexit, while putting the Franco-German unity to the test. 1 month ago, you probably remember, The Economist had its cover on how paranoid nationalism corrupts. If we are not careful, the 2020s could bring us back to a situation reminiscent of the darkest hours of the European history of the 1930s. And the tragic events in Israel since Saturday are a very unfortunate reminder of this sad reality. B, the disease of nationalism is jeopardizing international cooperation exactly at a time when we need it most. This is what I call the global public goods paradox. And by the way, you precisely explained it. Probably more than ever, the global community must safeguard and deliver on existential public goods. Ecological transition to address climate change, pandemic preparedness, digitalization and cybersecurity, financial stability in the face of increased global debt, to name just 4 of these public goods. We all agree these issues can only be resolved in a collective manner. None of us can tackle them alone. But meanwhile, multilateralism is in a crisis without precedent. Let us be candid. Once a beacon of great progress, the G20 is clearly underperforming. Can I give one very serious example, which is a warning? On climate change, I have serious concern that this priority is at present at risk of fading away, as observed in the most recent G20 and international discussions, due also to the increased polarization of political debates around climate in the US. Europe is ahead, the rest of the world shouldn't lag behind. This would be my wish, my call for the Marrakesh agenda in the next days. But more generally, as geopolitical rifts deepen and trust fades, it is becoming more and more difficult for the international fora, including the IMF and the FDBs, to deliver on their mandates. Let us be honest. Multilateralism is first and foremost the victim of the Russian war, but also partially of a backlash against the predominance of the global North in the post-World War II international order. Only a system in which each country feels legitimately represented will be viable in the long term. I will come to it later. Third hard fact, C, which is less hard, and to give some hope after this dark landscape. A few lessons drawn from European cooperation. I am a dedicated European, but I think it's not a Eurocentric view because it can be of interest for the non-Europeans in the audience. As imperfect as it is, the European Union is a historical experiment in overcoming decades, centuries of nationalist rivalry, from which we can draw several useful lessons for today's multilateral challenges. The first lesson relates to the objective of cooperation. I mentioned it earlier. To bring results, multilateral action should focus on limited, pragmatic, and shared objectives. This was precisely, and perhaps it will surprise you, the spirit of the founding fathers of Europe. Let me quote Robert Schuman, a French and more or less German, in 1950. Europe will be built through concrete achievements which first create de facto solidarity. And it all started with Schuman Declaration, with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, 1951. This was not very glamorous, coal and steel, but concrete, followed by the common agricultural policies and the single market, the advent of the euro, and now the Green Deal. We could adopt a similar strategy at the international level, focused multilateralism. A second interesting lesson relates to governance. Europe is a unique endeavor of shared governance between sovereign states, with several interesting features. A powerful secretariat in the form of the European Commission, a shift in its voting rules from unanimity to qualified majority on most issues, not all, in the Council of the European Union, the decision-making body that brings together ministers of member states, which means that for all these decisions, no country has a veto. And a clear hierarchy of legal norms with EU law superseding that of the national laws of member states and guaranteed by a European Court of Justice. A third lesson, the last one, relates to geography. The European Union has adapted and evolved through successive enlargements to new member states, from the 6 founding countries to the current 27-member union. In the process, the Union has undergone profound changes with a notable rebalancing towards Eastern Europe. The move of Europe to the East probably brings useful lessons for the hoped move of Bretton Woods institutions to the South. In response to these 3 hard facts, 3 needs must be met. The first step, I will be very quick on that, is now to honor our commitments on the reforms of the international financial institutions. We mentioned them during the afternoon. One reform has been achieved. The global community has delivered on its commitment to rechannel at least $100 billion of SDR to the countries that need it most, as my friend Jean-Claude Brou said. We can hope, and it would be a decisive step in Marrakesh, to conclude the ongoing 16th General Review of Quotas, which would give the fund more firepower by leading to an increase in overall quotas of at least 35%. And on MDBs, the G20 leaders endorsed a dedicated roadmap which could provide them with an additional capacity of around $200 billion over the next decade. All these advances are significant, and this is the glass half full. But they should be implemented effectively and as soon as possible. Let us be clear again, there have been too many broken promises in the past. Restoring everyone's confidence in multilateralism, particularly in the South, means first and foremost, today at long last, walking our talk at end. This is the first need. I come to the next step, which is to go beyond this measure to truly rebuild multilateral cooperation. We share here probably the conviction that multilateralism is at a crossroads, or let's say a Darwinian moment. It must evolve in order to survive, or else it might die. To this end, why not start by creating a special task force as an amplifier of the 2017, remember, EPG, Eminent Persons Group, with balanced, chaired by our friend Tarman at the time, with balanced representation of the international community. This independent group would be charged at high level with suggesting more ambitious avenue for reforms in the IFIs. Let me dream somewhat and provide some food for thought built on the lesson, as I said, of the European experience. First, we would need to move towards unquestionable fairness in the governance of the IFIs, as also advocated recently by the French President Emmanuel Macron. This means ensuring a fairer seat, yes, at the table for emerging and developing countries. And this means, at some point, a revision of the IMF's quota distribution. But the emerging countries that will benefit from this, including China, will have to accept common rules of the game. And these include a fair share of debt restructuring and of the financing of global public goods, starting with climate change. We should also consider adjusting the majority voting rules at the IMF in order to soften veto power. Bernard Snoy mentioned some of Michel's ideas. You are probably aware of the so-called Palais Royal initiative. I love this headline because it's in Paris, and it was a group gathered around Michel, Bernard, and others in you were a member probably in 2011, and you are probably aware that Palais Royal is a magnificent building in the center of Paris, and it happens to be more or less the headquarters of the Banque de France. So think of the Palais Royal initiative, which recommended lowering the majority rule from the current 85%. The global economic governance, furthermore, should be formalized and given a strong political impetus. Bernard mentioned another part of the Palais Royal initiative, which is the activation of a council already enshrined in the IMF's articles, which would bring together the 24 members of the International Monetary and Financial Committee and the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors. It would become a political body, and in operational terms, this revived G20 or G24 could be provided formal rules of governance, including, yes, this is my dream, qualified majority voting in some areas, and it changed everything, and including a permanent secretariat which could be provided by reformed IFIs, IMF, and World Bank. In order to achieve concrete results, this revived G20 or G24 should build on this pragmatic multilateralism I call for and stick to a limited agenda with, this is sequencing, a medium-term horizon, say 2030. Global issues on which deliverables could converge include climate change mitigation as a canonical global public good, debt restructuring, and pandemic preparedness. I mentioned three needs. The third need relates to the functioning of the International Monetary System, IMS. Despite the end of the Bretton Woods system in the 70s, the US dollar still plays a dominant role. Nevertheless, its decline, while very gradual, in the share of global foreign exchange reserve and the current geopolitical situation are reviving the debate about its role as the anchor of the IMS. But there is also a but. It would be worse than anything else to shift from a dollar-dominated system to a confrontational non-system. Fragmentation, especially if it is disorderly, would generate instability and inefficiency, especially from a crisis management perspective. We are all aware, for instance, that a fragmented global financial safety net, GFSN, is an inefficient one. It would undermine convertibility of reserves and result in inefficient and costly excessive reserve accumulation. Having said this, let me be more positive and focus our efforts towards the creative frontier, this is an expression we used often this afternoon, of a resilient and truly balanced multipolar system. The global community would be, according to me, better off discussing the evolution of the IMS in a coordinated international dialogue based on a few practical guiding principles. And here I will remain at the first part of sequencing. I will not mention in this practical step, or not yet, a global central bank or a global currency. But can I suggest 4 steps? Fostering cross-border payments and digitalization. And this is part of the G20 roadmap, but we have to deliver to achieve a more efficient international system of payments. Think of remittances, for instance. It would represent a substantial lever for increasing trade, reducing cost, and promoting integration between countries. Another step would be developing a consistent regulatory and supervisory framework to ensure that the development of crypto assets and private stablecoins does not undermine public confidence in the financial system. We agree in principle following the Indian G20, but now we have to implement this regulation Time is running out. Another step, possibly, would be that the currencies of this multipolar system, including, of course, the euro, and probably starting with those of the SDR basket, should all commit to rules of convertibility and stability. I refer in particular to a common inflation anchor, such as exists, and not by chance, between the euro, the dollar, the yen, and sterling, of around 2%. To quote another of my predecessors, Jean-Claude Trichet has often stressed this. I mentioned 4 steps. The last one could be that reviving our crisis prevention capacity under the principles of the IMF's integrated policy framework. It should allow a more balanced mix of tools, including intervention in the currency market and macroprudential and capital flow management measures. So these were my 3 hard facts, 3 needs or steps in response. But I mentioned one hope as the 7th pillar of wisdom. And this is a strong belief I would like to share with you. In the midst of the current shifts on the international scene, a strong Europe is instrumental for the international cooperation, and not only for Europeans. Europe stands as a unique endeavor in which countries have freely and peacefully decided to unite their efforts, founded on the values of freedom, democracy, and rule of law. Hence, there can be no doubt whose sides we are on when it comes to Russian aggression. But Europe is supported by a soft power based on compliance with international rules, the highest ODA, official development assistance worldwide, and openness to the South. In the context of the rising rivalry between the US and China, the European Union is building, offering, a possible model of non-hegemonic power, but strong values. Europe has been, in the 20th century, a pioneering model of social progress, combining lower levels of inequality with a higher level of public services and a social safety net. I think it can now forge, in the 21st century, a pioneering environmental model useful for other parts of the world. And the fragmented international environment definitely needs new institutional skills, and believe me, European institutional skills are very sophisticated. To quote Robert Schuman again, the contribution which an organized and living Europe can bring to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations. Let me conclude. We live in the decade of decisive choices. The global order is confronted with a destructive triangle of fragmentation, isolation, confrontation. Let us build a more promising perspective with an alternative triangle of competition, solidarity, cooperation. And here I use the words of Jacques Delors, the former chair of the European Commission. We need competition that stimulates, cooperation that strengthens, and solidarity that unites. Europe, despite all its imperfection, has shown that this triangle could be made reality. Thank you for listening to these personal dreams I wanted to share with you in Marrakesh.
Thank you very much, Governor. This was wonderful, very inspiring, right on the mark. I just have one question. Can we get a copy of your remarks and share it with everyone?
This is a simpler question than the ones I tried to address. The answer is yes. Can I add one word? Because I happen to be chair of the BIS, chair of the board, Bank of International Settlements, and some of my fellow governors are here. When I look for reasons to hope in international cooperation, we have at least among central bankers a real treasure, which is mutual trust. And due to trustworthy, confidential, regular dialogue among ourselves, we can share our questions, we can share our diagnosis, and we are sure it will never leak. I think that the Emerging Market Forum can also help in a different format to promote such dialogue and trust. This is not in the figures, this is not measurable, but this is probably the first driver of international cooperation.
Thank you. We'll be happy to do that, and you're amongst friends. You know, we've been meeting for now 18 years. This is our 37th meeting, and while we have new people coming in every meeting, but people have trust amongst each other and they talk frankly. Do you have 5 more minutes for 1 or 2 questions, or you have to rush? I know you came straight from Paris, from Orly.
No, it's possible, but you must be exhausted. So we'll see if there are questions.
But this is so stimulating, and this is, you know, really a highlight of our forum so far. 2 questions, and then we let Governor go and wash, and I'm sure he has a lot of things to do, and long line of people who want to meet. 2 questions. Who wants to raise the first question? Anybody? Please.
Thank you, Governor. That was fantastic. I'm Isabel Kane from Australia, but also based in Paris. I think drawing your example on the EU was a really clear example of what other regions can do to build cooperation. Could you talk a little bit to some of the divisions that are happening in Europe now, like with the Slovak election recently, and with Poland sort of moving away from the towing of the line, just to share with us how divisions maybe can be overcome so that economic cooperation can continue?
Here, I could be longer than 5 minutes. But no, I will try to be short. I think probably you live in Paris, as I understand, so you see how difficult it is, and there are tensions. But probably the 2 key levels are, first, we are quite clear about the areas where we decide together. And I will take the example I know best, which is the euro. You are probably aware that the creation of a single currency was really a dream in the start. It started in the 70s. There were a European monetary system, there were failures, there was a Black Wednesday, etc. But we were clear that we wanted to achieve that. And second, we had an institutional agreement with a strong common institution. This is the ECB, fully independent, and with a clear majority voting system. It's majority voting. And these are the 2 ingredients of the cocktail. The wisest man or woman in the room probably remembers that I was among the many small workers of the euro at the start of the 90s. I was in Maastricht. And there was much economic literature, a clear majority of economic literature saying it will never work. It will not work because it's unprecedented. you have a single currency with, at that time, 12 states, now 20. You will not resist a crisis. You will not resist 20 different fiscal policies. And these are all challenges. But what happened was the contrary. Through the crisis, through stress test, it became more and more solid and more popular. We have now interest rates which are much higher than some years ago, but the euro is more popular than ever. Because it worked. It worked, it was a clear focus and a strong institution. So let us be clear, if we transpose it to the international level, it means sharing sovereignty. I don't know if it fits well in English, you will tell me, Olinda. If I said it in French, because I understand there are French translations, partager une souveraineté pour la retrouver.
To share sovereignty, to recover it.
What does it mean? When you explain to 20 countries in Europe or to 100 countries worldwide, take the tax agreement, that they will have to renounce to part of their apparent sovereignty. They will have to have a minimum level of taxation, say. Probably the first reaction is to say, I will not abandon my sovereignty. But the reality is that it's only an apparent sovereignty. That if this was a situation pre-Euro, frankly, the monetary policy was in some countries, I don't need to quote, more important than in others. And if you look at the taxation policy, if there are loopholes, if there are tax havens, your apparent sovereignty is not for real. So you have to make this step. And we had a difficult debate for the euro, and it's true for everybody we shared. But the idea is that it's a win-win game at the end. But it's a difficult step, because if you think that you can solve pandemic or climate change alone, it's a tragical mistake.
Thank you. One more question.
Monsieur le gouverneur, je vais parler en français.
Governor, I'll speak in French. I'm senior fellow at the Policy Center. First, I'd like to congratulate you on your intervention, a very logical and rational intervention. And I think you're right when you say that the European Union heeded the constraints and obstacles to advance its integration following COVID. After the pandemic, it unified its debt approach. And with the Ukrainian war, what we have seen that there is progress politically and strategically. It's not been easy. And it's opening up to other countries in the East. I think at the same time, if Europe is to play an important role to advance multipolarity, it can only do so if it takes into account its geography and its history, meaning its proximity. And it needs to reconcile with the global South. And I'm thinking of the Mediterranean especially. We know from what has been happening recently, Europe needs to play an important part to promote the conditions of a just peace. The South is also Africa, the neighboring Africa. And it seems to me that in the face of bipolarism as we see today, the United States versus China, it needs to build a verticality with Europe at the north and Africa down south. I think it's the main role it needs to play in coming decades. Thank you.
In English. Did everybody understand the question, which was more which was more a powerful thought, another dream. I will perhaps answer in English, while I prefer speaking French, but first, thank you for your compliment saying my thoughts are Cartesian. You are probably all know this famous philosopher of the 17th century, Descartes, who is seen as the most rational thinker. And so we are all supposed to be Cartesian. But there is another paradox that Descartes, he was born in France, but he almost never lived in France. I looked to Bernard, didn't live in Belgium because Belgium did not exist at that time, but it lived in what we would call Netherlands, or at least in other countries. So let's say Cartesian is European. And the present world is not rational, is not Cartesian, obviously. So we should bring structured thoughts, we should bring really some vision. I think it's useful. The one you shared is a powerful vision. I am not enough specialist in diplomacy to say your vertical between Europe, Mediterranean, and Africa would be the axis. But for sure, Africa is the continent of the next century. It's true for Europe, but I think it's true for multilateral institutions. Asia is obviously the continent of this century, and Olinda, I reassure you, it will not disappear at all. But the rise of Africa will be the next frontier of our world order. So, if Europe plays it well, it has a unique chance due to this proximity. But when I mentioned the role of Europe in international cooperation, it was not only that, or perhaps not mainly that. I think that our experience, our values, our openness bring something for the institutional mechanism, game of multilateralism. And if I had to conclude with this sentence, this is another call of Marrakesh. I made a call on climate change, but I think that Europe shouldn't be too shy. Obviously, we are not a military power, or not enough. We are not a politically unified force. But Europe is not only inwards looking. It's not only for its own peace and prosperity, which is already very important. Europe has something to bring to the rest of the world. And this is a huge challenge for us, but I think there can be huge rewards for everybody.
Thank you. There was a very good thoughts to conclude. So, you know, what I tell my friends, if I allow me to say that some people say Europe has contributed so much to the world in the past. Let me say Europe has so much to contribute also in the future. And this is what we like to say, and Governor, let me end with one more thought. I would very much like to accept what you said, that our forum will be delighted to carry your message of your keynote address. That was a very powerful one. If we can help in any way to promote the multilateralism the way you described it, I think it's very important for the entire world, including emerging markets, which is our cause. We'll be delighted. So please join me in thanking the governor for coming to talk to us and giving us such an environment. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. We have now concluded our sessions for the day. Please make sure to return your translation headset at the registration desk before leaving the building. The Emerging Markets Forum and the Policy Center for the New South invite you all to attend the gala reception and dinner at the Centre de Formation de Marrakech, located at a 5-minute drive from this venue, starting at 8 p.m. Shuttles will depart from this venue starting at 7:45 p.m. Please meet us at Dar al-Phosphate lobby to organize departure. Enjoy your evening and see you tomorrow at 8:30 a.m.